All right, so let's go ahead and jump over to 1 Samuel chapter 29 and 30. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David that sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" Achish answered, "I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said he must not go up with us into the battle. Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Chapter 30. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" "Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." David and the 600 men with him came to the Bezor Valley, with where some stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley, but David and the other 400 continued in pursuit. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat. Part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins he ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and nights. David asked him, "Who do you belong to? Where do you come from?" He said, "I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them." He led David down, and there they were scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away except for 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. David discovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else that they had taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow them and were left behind at the Bezor Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and the men approached, he asked them how they were. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and his children and go." David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. We all will share alike." David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." David sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth, Negev, Jatar, to those of Aor, Shifmoth, and Esto, Esh, Eshtemio, there we go, and Rachel. To those in the towns of Jerahmeelites and Kenites, to those in Horem, Bor Ashim, Athik, and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where he and his men had roamed. All right, that is 1 Samuel chapter 29 and 30. All right, so before we begin to unpack this, I want to point something out, and just go ahead and turn the page back to chapter 28. We're going to look at how chapter 28 starts. So, chapter 28, verse 1 reads, "In those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, 'You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army.' And David said, 'Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do.' Achish replied, 'Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life.'" Now, the interesting thing is that the author of 1 Samuel starts to tell us about the situation of the Philistines and the Israelites going to war. So that's the first part here that we read in chapter 28. And then ba- basically a shift occurs, and the author tells us the story of Saul and the witch of Endor, and Saul seeking out Samuel's guidance after he had passed. And the rest of the chapter is about that. So it's really easy to miss that the story that we now pick up, we return to in chapters 29 and 30, actually started at the beginning of chapter 28. And it says in verse 1, chapter 28, verse 1, "In those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel." Achish says to David, "You've been with me for more than a year now, and guess what, buddy? And this is where you get to show me your real allegiance. You're going to come with me into battle." And David says, "Oh, this is exactly what we've been waiting to do. You're going to be able to see how well we can perform for you." And that's where Achish says, "Very well, I make you my bodyguard for life." There's a hint there in this last sentence when Achish says, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." That carries through into chapters 29 and 30. And that is that it appears that Achish, who is the king of Gath, right? So Gath is one of 5 of the Philistine city states. So he is the king of Gath, one of the 5 lords of the Philistines, and he seems to be rather gullible, as we'll see as we move forward into chapter 29. All right, so now back to chapter 29. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, this is supposed to paint a picture that there was a whole lot of soldiers in the Philistine army. David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. So David and his men, his 600 men, are there. This turns out to be a terrific blunder of David, and we'll get more to why this is a blunder here in a bit. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" So the generals of the Philistine army saw David and his 600 men marching at the back of the crowd with Achish, or back of the troops with Achish. And we're asking, what are they doing here? They knew of David. They knew who David was. And they knew that David was an Israelite. And they probably all thought that it was foolish what Achish had done by allowing David to live in Achish's kingdom, the city surrounding, or the territory surrounding the city of Gath. The commanders asked the Philistines, "What are what about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who is an officer of Saul, king of Israel? You know who he is what he's saying. You know who he is. You know this is David. He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." Well, what we know is that David is actually deceiving Achish. David has moved out of the land of Israel. He's moved out of God's promised land, and he's moved out of God's will. God never told David to go to the Philistine territory. David stepped out. And the reason he stepped out is that he was sick and tired of being chased by Saul. It's probably 10 years that David has been chased by Saul, and he leaves Israel and goes to Gath to get out of Saul's reach, because he is depressed and he is tired. He just wants to be done with that. But again, that's not anything that God ever asked him to do, and he's moved out of God's will, and he's opened himself up to other sin by being there. And David and his men are carrying out raids, and they are deceiving Achish. Achish has no idea that that's what David and his men are doing. Verse 4, but the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him." Well, you'll remember that David asked Achish, he basically suggested, he says, "Achish, you've been very gracious, for hosting me and my men and their wives and their children. You've been very generous, but this doesn't make much sense. Why don't you give me an area that we can live in? Why don't you give me Ziklag?" And Achish does that. And so David and his men and their families set up home in Ziklag and basically make it David's town. So he says to him, "Send him back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men?" Well, so the commanders were pretty smart about this. They said, "Look, there's a problem here with David. I know that you trust him, and I have no doubt that he's capable, but do you really want him to becoming a turncoat in the middle of battle? Do you really want to handle that? Do you want to have somebody that's in our ranks who can attack and kill our men so that he can get back in favor with Saul?" And then they say, "Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And these commanders, they're not naive. They know that when the Israelites were singing the song, they were singing the praises of David and the number of Philistines he had killed. So they had a long memory. And they say, this man cannot be trusted. He is not going into battle with us. Verse 6. So Achish called David and said to him, as surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you. But the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers. So that's the other four lords, right? The four other Philistine lords. Again, Achish looks pretty gullible here because David has deceived him. He and his men have been going out and doing raids, but totally under Achish's nose, and he is oblivious to what David and his men have been up to. Verse 8, then David responds with, but what have I done? Asked David. What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Well, here's an interesting thing. I'm not quite sure what David says here. I'm not quite sure what his motivation is. There's a couple possibilities. One is that he is disappointed that the commanders of the Philistine army don't trust David and his men. But actually, the larger question is, would David have actually attacked the Israelite armies? Would he have killed his countrymen? Would he have totally turned his back on Israel? Would he commit a sin that he would regret the rest of his life? By what's said here in verse 8, it sounds like he would. But I question that that's really the case. And is he not placating Achish at this point? Is he not going, I knew, I'm glad that I didn't have to go through with it. I dodged another bullet there. Could this actually be the provision of God to keep David from committing a sin that he would regret the rest of his life by killing the Israelite soldiers and attacking his own people? And I think it's more of the latter, but that's not the quick read. The quick read, but what have I done? Asked David. What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Lowercase l, right? So he's talking about Achish. Why can't I go? You know that I'm your man, Achish. You know that I would defend you to the death. Maybe this is an opportunity for David to proclaim, quote unquote, doing air quotes, his loyalty to Achish, knowing that he's not going to have to follow through with it, and he's not going to have to be confronted with killing his own countrymen, his own flesh and blood. And I think this is also a provision of God, that God is saving David from committing a sin that he's going to regret the rest of his life. Remember, God didn't ask him to go to Philistia. He didn't ask him to move to Gath. He's moved out of God's will. He's not living under God's will right now, and he's doing things that are outside of God's will. But God is still, even though that's the case, God is still providing for David. God is still trying to keep David from making serious missteps. And how many times in our lives has the Lord intervened for us and kept us from committing a sin that we would regret the rest of our lives? And that's what's going on here for David. Verse 9, Achish answered, I know that you've been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, you must not go up with us into battle. Wow. Talking about flowery language. right? So Achish says, I know you have been as pleasing in my eye as an angel of God. David has really snowed Achish. He's really done a snow job on Achish, and he considers him to be as pleasing as an angel of God. Uh, One of the other things that's going on here is I wonder if David's faithfulness to the God of Israel, to Yahweh, to Jehovah, hasn't rubbed off on Achish a little bit. Because angel of God is not a Philistine concept. They were into 100% into idolatry. And so maybe a little bit of David is rubbing off on Achish here. But he tells him, nevertheless, doesn't matter what I think, David. It's been determined you're not to go into battle with us. Now, get up early, along with your master's servants, who have come with you, his 600 men, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light. So I know that it's getting late, and it's dangerous to travel in the dark. So don't leave until tomorrow, but leave at first light so that nothing bad could possibly happen, or you can not, if you leave early in the morning, you're not going to tick off the commanders, the Philistine commanders, any further. Verse 11. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. One interesting feature of this passage is the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So they are positioning themselves for the battle against the Israelite armies. And Jezreel is near a valley that's rather famous, famous to this day. We would know this valley better as Armageddon. So Jezreel is actually on one, or close to one edge of the valley where the last battle on earth will be fought, the great battle.
Hey,
Uh,
Perry,
Go ahead, Tom.
is it not possible that David had in his mind that he was going to ambush him from the rear as they were attacking, as the rest of his troops were attacking the Israelites from the front?
Yeah, it is possible. Now, it's not stated here that that was David's overt plan, but David was being made to come along by Achish. So it is within the realm of possibility that he could have turned on the Philistine armies and created a break in their line, which would have given the Israelite armies a clear advantage. But we don't know that, right? What we do know is that God kept David from being put in that difficult position of whether or not he was going to fight with the Philistines or fight against the Philistines. So in the early 1800s, I think it was around 1812, Napoleon and his armies, when they conquered much of the Middle East, marched past or through the Valley of Jezreel and Armageddon. And Napoleon is said to have commented that never has he seen in all his travels a better place to hold a battle. And it's just interesting that the final battle, the great battle at our end during our end times, is going to occur in the same place. And this is where the Philistine armies had mustered to go into battle against the Israelites. And so that area, that valley, has been used for warfare for millennia. All right, over to chapter 30. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. So this was a tremendous blunder of David's. Maybe David had a false sense of security, because remember that all 600 of his men marched with David and the Philistine armies. Usually you leave somebody behind as a security team to protect your camp, your fortress, your cities. And David didn't do that. The Amalekites are still angry with David for raiding them. And so, with David not there, they use this as an opportunity to wreak retribution on David. And they attack Ziklag, and none of David's men are there. And they burn it to the ground. Now, this is also the providence of God, that they didn't kill anyone, that they took all the women and the children, they took them with them along with all the other spoils, which would have been the cattle and anything of value that they could find. When David raided the Amalekite towns and the towns surrounding the territory around where he was in Philistia, David was killing women and children to leave no witnesses, because that's what allowed them to deceive Achish. And it's just interesting that the Amalekites, although they were taking retribution on David, that they didn't kill anyone. And I think that that's no accident. I think that's actually the provision of God here. They attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. Verse 3. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because his men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. So there's a bunch in this paragraph to talk about. So the men were all distressed when they got back to the town of Ziklag and found it burned to the ground, and everybody's gone. Everybody's gone. And they were so distressed that they wept until they were exhausted. And even David's wives were taken. Then David was very distressed because he had a mutiny on his hands. His men knew that David had screwed up. They knew that David had made a tremendous blunder. What David should have done is leave at least 200 men behind there in Ziklag as a security team. But he didn't do that. Instead, he followed Achish, and he followed him completely, right? To the letter of the law, as it were, right? All 600, David and all 600 of his men went to march with Achish. That was a tremendous blunder. And David's men were blaming David for the destruction of Ziklag and for their wives and children being taken captive. So the men were talking about stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. Now, why does it say because of his sons and daughters? Were they not upset that they lost their wives? No, the men were assuming that the women were all killed, and that the Amalekites would have only taken the sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord. This is a really interesting phrase. With all of this agony, all of this distress going on, David hits the pause button to regroup and find strength in the Lord. And this is one of the practices, one of the features of David, And one of the reasons that God loves David, because when the times get tough, David, wherever he is, goes to God. And we see those times recorded in the book of Psalms. And when we are experiencing and going through times of distress in our own lives, because of what David wrote and is recorded in the book of Psalms, we can find solace and comfort and strength in the Lord today. And I want to take a look at that. So if you'll turn with me in your Bibles, go and find the 23rd Psalm, which is probably, the best known Psalm in all the world. But we're going to take a look at that. So head to the book of Psalms and then the 23rd chapter of the 23rd Psalm. Give you just a minute to get there. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, lesser known is the next psalm, and I want to take a look at that, Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. Who may ascend the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in the holy place? Who has clean hands and a pure heart? Who does not lift up his soul to an idol or swear by what is false? He will receive blessings from the Lord and vindication from God his Savior. Such is the generation of those who seek him and seek your face, O God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, O you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O you gates. Lift them up, you ancient doors. The King of glory may come in. Who is he, the King of glory? The Lord Almighty, he is the King of glory. A very praiseful passage, the Psalms 24. Like I said, Psalms 23, probably the best known psalm, followed by Psalm 24, which is a little known psalm, but is no less glorious than Psalm 23. David hit the pause button to take out time to gain strength, to spend time with God and regain his strength in the Lord. Verse 7. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. You will surely overtake them and succeed in rescue. Another interesting passage, because remember, Saul had killed all the priests. Only Abiathar, the son of Ahinoam, the high priest, had survived. And Abiathar had taken with him the high priest's ephod. So we've talked before that there are two quote unquote ephods. One ephod is a linen apron that all the priests wore. But then the high priest's ephod was an arrangement. It was a breastplate, but it had went over the priestly ephod, so it went on top of this linen apron, and it had a breastplate with the 12 stones, one representing each tribe of Israel, and then on the shoulders, like epaulets, were the Urim and the Thummim. And on the Urim and the Thummim, so they sat, it's important that they sat on the shoulders of the high priest in this high priestly ephod. Engraved on each one were the 12 tribes of Israel, 6 on one shoulder and 6 on the other. Now, the imagery here is that the high priest was taking on the nation. He had the entire nation of Israel, all 12 tribes, on his shoulders. And we don't know how the Urim and Thummim in the high priestly ephod, how it was able to communicate, but David used it to seek God's guidance. Verse 8, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? He gets an answer using the Urim and Thummim and the high priestly ephod. Pursue them. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in rescue. We don't know how that was done. We don't know if they glowed, if there was a voice that spoke. We don't know. But David got an answer. Now, the reason that it's significant that the ephod was, that the Urim and the Thummim were on the shoulders of the high priest, and that when the priest went to the altar of prayer in the temple, that he brought with him, or he carried with him on his shoulders the nation of Israel, is because Jesus, as our high priest, carries us, all of us, unto the altar of God, taking our burdens, taking our sins and our failures on himself, carrying all of humanity on his shoulders as he comes before God. What an image. Jesus is our high priest, similar to the human high priest, taking upon his shoulders not just the 12 tribes of Israel as the human high priest did, but all of humanity. Turn with me to the book of Hebrews. So we're now going to go to the New Testament and head to the book of Hebrews. So that's towards the rear, almost, but not quite, to the book of Revelation. And we're headed to chapter 7. Chapter 7. And then, so Hebrews chapter 7, and we're going to read starting at verse 25. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Such a high priest meets our needs, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever. So again, a wonderful picture, precursor, foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, our perfect high priest, in the human, the imperfect high priests. So David inquires using Abiathar and the high priestly ephod. And again, Saul had killed all the priests, and Abiathar was now the only legitimate priest, and he was also the only legitimate high priest. It's within the realm of possibility that Saul had appointed new priests. But seeing as he killed all of them, they would not have been legitimate. None of them would have been from the line of Aaron, because they were all dead except for Abiathar. So whatever Saul was doing to placate himself and make himself feel better before God was ineffectual. It was not legitimate. David, having Abiathar, actually was legitimate, except that, again, he'd moved out from under God's will as he left Israel, the promised land, and was now living in Philistia. Then David said to Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. You certainly will overtake them and succeed in the rescue. David and the 600 men with him came to the Bezor Valley, where some stayed behind, 200 of them too exhausted to cross the valley. But David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. Now, these 200 men that were too exhausted to go on, it was justified that they were exhausted. They weren't wimping out, as it were, because the distance between Ziklag and Bezor is 60 miles. So they had just done a 60-mile fast march. That was on the heels of traveling back from the armies of the Philistines, wherever they were, when Achish confronted David and said, no, no, this is where you stop. You can't go into battle with us. So these men actually traveled a long way in a very short period of time, and 200 of them, or 1/3, were too exhausted to continue. So they stayed behind there in Bezor, and this becomes important here in a little bit. But David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. Along the way, they found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. So David and his men are continuing their pursuit, and they run across this Egyptian guy in the middle of nowhere. What are you doing out here? And the guy is famished, he's hungry, he's thirsty, he's also sick. What are you doing out here? David interrogates him. Who do you belong to and where do you come from? He said, I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. So he was in the raiding party. He was a slave of one of the Amalekites. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. So his master, in such a loving way, said, huh, you're sick? Well, good luck to you. Have a nice life. And he left him for dead, or he left him to die out there in the desert. Whenever you see Negev, and we're going to see it here in a bit, we're talking about desert. We're talking about the southern portion of Israel that is mostly desert. So he continues, my master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb. That is the Caleb, the one of the spies that entered the promised land and advised Joshua that the land was full of milk and honey and we should go after it, where the other reports came back negative. These giants, they'll eat us alive. So we raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. Oh, there it is. Wow. If there was any doubt before who it was that burned Ziklag, they just got an in-person or first-person confirmation that they had burned Ziklag. David asked him, can you lead me down to this raiding party? So David's thinking, I can use this guy. And the slave answered, or the Egyptian answered, swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them. So this Egyptian, as most people in that region would have known about Israel's God and how loyal, faithful most Israelites were to their God, so he could make David or ask David to swear by his God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master. I do not. That guy, I mean, he left me for dead. He left me to just die in the wilderness and be eaten by the animals. Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them. He led David down, and there they were. So the Egyptian took them right to the Amalekite raiding party, saved David and his men a bunch of time to look for him. They were scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. Remember, the Ziklag was just one of the places that they raided. They had taken booty from multiple places, multiple cities that they had raided. Verse 17. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day. So almost 24 hours. And none of them got away, except for 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. So 400 young Amalekites had transportation, and as soon as David and his men started doing battle, and it was clear that the Amalekites were not going to survive this attack. 400 young men fled off on camels. Probably that's the sum total of the camels that they had with them. But it also gives you an idea of this was not a small raiding party of the Amalekites. This was actually a lot of people that were part of this raiding party. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his two wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. Again, this speaks of God's provision. This talks about God's care. That none of the wives, they assumed the wives were all killed. And they assumed that the Amalekites would have taken the young men and the girls back to be their slaves. But none of the wives were killed. No one was killed. And David recovered all of them, plus everything else that the Amalekites had plundered, not just from Ziklag, but from all of the raiding that the Amalekites had done. It says David brought back everything. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder. This belongs to David. These are the spoils of David's war." David didn't have to go to battle against his own people with the Philistines. David was able to do battle against the Amalekites, and God blessed him in it, and he recovered everything, every last thing that the Amalekites had taken. This is David's plunder. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at the Bezor Valley. Now, this is a problem because 400 of David's men had been fighting the Amalekites for nearly a 24-hour period. And though it had been profitable and God's hand had been with them, these 200 that stayed behind because they were exhausted, do they really deserve any of the bounty? I mean, what did they have to do for it? They were the ones that were weenies and were too exhausted to go on. So now David is left with a decision. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. But all the evil men and troublemakers amongst David's followers said, "Because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go." So isn't that big of them? They're not going to, the 200 men that stayed behind because they were too exhausted to continue, they can take their families back, but then they need to leave. And it's interesting that it says, but all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers. So when you have 600 men, you're going to have all kinds of people. And some of those men, they were troublemakers. And no doubt some of these men were thinking very highly of themselves after successfully routing the Amalekite attackers. And bringing back with them a bountiful booty of spoils, and they don't want to share it. They say that the 200 men that stayed behind at Bezor are undeserving. Verse 23. David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the men who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike." So David is being a wise leader here. And he's saying, nope, we're not going to do what you said. What you're talking about is foolishness. I understand that they stayed behind because they were too exhausted, but they are still part of us. And because they're part of us, they get to enjoy the profits as well. They get their own share of the spoils. David made this a statute and an ordinance for Israel from that day to this. There's a transition that occurs here. Did you catch it? Verse 25 is talking about that present moment, but then also moving into the future when David is king. From that moment forward, David made this a principle, a rule under his reign, that because you are part of us, you are able to share in the same spoils as everyone else. And David is stepping into his kingly role. That's the transition. David made this a statute and an ordinance for Israel from that day to this. So at the time of the writing of 1 Samuel, this was still a policy, an ordinance, a principle of David, that if you are part of us, that you get an equal share of the profits. Verse 26. When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah who were his friends, saying, "Here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." Again, David's making he's he's actually preparing for his transition from being a leader of a band of 600 men to being the king of Israel. And not only that, but what Saul was not able to accomplish was a unified Israel. David is going to do that. Part of David's greatness as a king will become that he unifies all of the individual 12 tribes of Israel into one nation. And then, because Jerusalem had never been taken from the Jebusites, through the campaigns of Joshua leading into the promised land, the only people that they were unable to defeat because of the natural fortifications of Jerusalem were the Jebusites until David. David, when he steps into that role as king, he will conquer the city of Jerusalem and make it his capital. Because it belonged to the Jebusites, it was like a Washington, D.C. It didn't belong to any particular state. It didn't belong to any particular tribe. It was neutral ground. And after he routed the Jebusites out, he sets it up as his capital. Where do you think that principle of Washington, D.C. and how it doesn't belong to any particular state came from? It wasn't reverse. We didn't come up with the idea first and then David implemented it. No, the other way around. That was part of David's future greatness and the geopolitical decisions that David makes in setting up Jerusalem as a neutral capital for the entire nation, unifying the people. And the transition starts here when David makes this decision that if you're a part of us, you get to share in the profits, no matter how hard you worked. When David reached Ziklag, he set some of the plunder to the elders of Judah. So what he's doing here is David is thanking the elders of Judah in the southern regions of Judah thanking them for their loyalty and their help. When David and his men, before they left Israel and went to Philistine, how they were sympathetic to David being chased by Saul, and they actually helped David and his men. That's part of it. The other part of it is David is building his constituency base for when he takes over as king. David is building his base, his power base, for when he moves into his new role as king. When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." David sent it to those in Bethel, Ramoth, Negev, Jatir, those in Aor, Shifmoth, Este, this one's hard for me to say, Eshtemoa, and Rachel, and to those in the towns of Jerahmeelites and Kenites, to those in Horam, Bor Asham, Athak, and Hebron, a wide area, and to those in all the other places where he and his men had roamed. And that is the end of 1 Samuel chapter 30. And what we will see in the last chapter of the first book of Samuel, so in chapter 31, is the death of Saul and the words that he was told when he visited the witch of Endor, that he was going to not be victorious against the Philistines, that the Philistines were going to beat Israel, and that both Saul and his son Jonathan would lose their lives in battle. Comments? Questions?
Yeah, also which way?
Hey, Perry.
Tom.
You talked about how the high priest was carrying the ephod. And so David was able to have information that Saul was not. But when I look back in 28:6, it says Saul inquired of the Urim. So what does that mean? So there was more than the one high priestly Urim?
Yeah, so I believe, Tom, I'm telling you what I believe and not what I know for certain. I believe that, like I said, um, Abiathar was the only legitimate high priest. And since Saul had killed all the other priests, he likely set up his own priests that were not legitimate and probably duplicated the ephod. But the salient point there is that God was not with Saul. God was silent. So Saul attempted to inquire of God for guidance, but God was silent because God had left Saul. God was not with Saul. But even though David was not in the promised land, that he'd moved out of Israel, God was still with David. And God responded when David inquired of him. Good question. Anything else?
I've got a comment, Perry.
Hey, Patrick.
Yeah, how's everybody today? I hope
Good.
Hope well.
Good.
Listen, the minute you said, if you're part of us, you get a share in the benefits. The first thing that jumped into my head was the parable that Jesus tells about the workers in the field. And some guys work 12 hours, some work 8, some work, all the way up to a half an hour, but he pays them all the same. And so you have the grumblers and the gripers and the people who would undermine, just like David's guys that he said, the evil guys, but he declares that everyone gets the benefit. Well, it's a lot like salvation. It's in the old gangster movies. the guy would get shot and he's dying. He yells, "Get me a priest," because he wants to do his last confession, right? But we do know people that die on their deathbeds and make deathbed confessions, and they're going to get the salvation. And the real ones, they're going to get their salvation, just like we have it. So it's a principle that comes all the way forward.
Patrick, I'm so glad that you made that connection. I didn't make that connection, but that's excellent. That's excellent and very appropriate for this passage. Thank you.
And David being the precursor to Jesus, it just makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It makes perfect sense. It,
Yeah.
it really does.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you for that.
All right.
Anything else?
Well, we can only imagine. There was a lot of killing going on. And, what was the percentage of the Hebrews being killed?
Well, we don't know. That's not recorded, is it, Daryl?
No, it's not.
Would you consider that like the wages of sin? That Hebrew lives were lost as well?
Well, there's always, that parallel. So that could be.
Yeah, so even though, well, anytime we move out of God's will, it is never the case that God leaves us. We go through things in our lives and there are times when we do step out of God's will. But we never lose our salvation. We never lose the hand of God or the mark of God upon us. But there are always consequences. And I think that that the Hebrew lies lost would have been part of the consequences. The fact that the town of Ziklag was burned to the ground is part of the consequences. So even though we're forgiven and even though we're saved, it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for our actions. Gentlemen, thank you very much for today. And please have a good rest of your week and go with God.
Hey, thanks, Perry.
Thank you, Perry.
Thanks, Perry.